The candle had burned all night, and by morning its wax had spilled in pale rivulets across the polished writing desk, hardening into ghostly shapes that caught the weak winter light. It stood at the very center of the mystery, tall and white in a brass holder, reduced now to a crooked stump. When Mrs. Elmsley forced open the door to her brother's study just after dawn, that candle was the first thing she noticed, still faintly smoking, as though resentful of the intrusion. The second was her brother himself, Mr. Julian Harcourt, slumped forward in his chair, his head resting against one arm, as though he had simply fallen asleep while reading. Only the unnatural angle of his wrist and the dreadful stillness of his shoulders betrayed the truth. The study at Rosebank Cottage was locked from the inside. The key remained in the door, turned firmly in its brass throat. The windows were latched, frost clung thickly to their panes, undisturbed. Outside, the garden lay silent beneath a brittle January sky, the gravel path unmarked save for Mrs. Elmsley's own hurried footprints. No weapon lay in sight, no overturned chair, no scattered papers. The room possessed the dreadful calm of a scene too orderly to be innocent. Word spread through St. Mary Mead with astonishing speed. By mid-morning, villagers had gathered in anxious clusters along the hedgerows, whispering beneath plumes of breath. Mr. Harcourt had not been a beloved man precisely, but he had been a fixture, wealthy, punctual, and scrupulously private. He kept to himself in Rosebank Cottage, entertaining few visitors and tolerating fewer interruptions. That he should die so quietly behind a locked door, with a single candle burned to nothing beside him, struck everyone as grotesquely theatrical. The doctor arrived first, red-faced and brisk, declaring that Mr. Harcourt had been dead for several hours. No visible wounds marked him. His tea-tray sat untouched upon a side table. The cup was cold, the milk unspoiled. A book lay open before him, its spine uncracked, suggesting he had scarcely begun to read. The only remarkable detail aside from the locked door was the candle. Mrs. Elmsley insisted her brother never used candles. He considered them medieval and kept to electric lamps, which were now switched off. The housemaid confirmed it. She had cleaned that very desk the previous afternoon, and no candle had stood upon it then. Inspector Drew from Much Benham examined the scene with growing irritation. "It's either the simplest matter in the world," he muttered, pacing the rug, "or someone has gone to great lengths to make fools of us." He tested the windows, inspected the hearth, even stooped to peer beneath the desk. Nothing. The chimney was too narrow for passage, the rug bore no damp footprints, the lock showed no tampering. The key, solid and heavy, could not have been turned from the outside without some elaborate contrivance scene. There was no sign of string, wire, or trickery. On the desk, beside the candle's congealed wax, lay a single envelope addressed in Mr. Harcourt's own hand. It bore no stamp. Inside was a sheet of paper containing just 3 words. "It must end." No signature, no date. The handwriting was steady, almost serene. Inspector Drew frowned at it as though the letters might rearrange themselves into something more useful. Suicide seemed implied. Yet there was no poison bottle, no pistol, no blade. The doctor could detect no obvious cause of death, though he admitted a thorough examination would be required. The villagers seized upon the candle as the heart of it all. Some declared it symbolic, others that it must have concealed a mechanism or signalled someone in the night. Mrs. Elmsley, pale and trembling, swore that her brother had retired early, as was his habit, shortly after 9. She herself had gone to bed at 10 and heard nothing, no footsteps, no raised voices. The housemaid, whose room was above the kitchen, claimed she had glimpsed a faint glow beneath the study door around midnight when she went downstairs for water. She had thought nothing of it then. By noon the little cottage felt less like a home, and more like a puzzle box that refused to open. A man sat dead behind a locked door. A candle had burned all night in a house where candles were never used. A note suggested despair without offering explanation. It was a crime at once absurdly simple and maddeningly intricate, as though the truth stood plainly in the room yet insisted upon disguising itself as something else entirely. It was shortly after Inspector Drew had ordered the desk and its contents to be carefully removed that Miss Marple arrived at Rosebank Cottage, wrapped in a dove-grey shawl and wearing an expression of mild concern that concealed a mind already alert. She had come ostensibly to offer comfort to Mrs. Elmsley, who was distantly connected to her through a web of parish acquaintances, but her pale blue eyes missed very little as she was ushered into the chilly drawing-room and told, in hushed tones, of the locked study and the candle that had burned all night. "My dear Mrs. Elmsley," she murmured gently, patting the woman's trembling hand, "such things are never quite as extraordinary as they first appear. though they do so enjoy pretending to be. And with that she requested very politely permission to step into the study before it was entirely dismantled. Inspector Drew, who had learned through experience that dismissing Miss Marple often proved unwise, inclined his head with reluctant courtesy. The room felt smaller now, heavy with official scrutiny. The body had been removed, yet its absence seemed to shout louder than its presence had. The candle stump remained upon the desk. The wax pooled and hardened like frozen milk. Miss Marple did not approach it at once. Instead, she stood just inside the doorway, observing the floorboards, the hearth, the angle of the chair. Her gaze lingered on the electric lamp positioned at the far corner of the desk. "You say he never used candles?" she asked quietly. "Never," Mrs. Elmsley replied from behind her. "He detested draughts and said candles guttered abominably." Miss Marple nodded and moved closer. The electric lamp's plug trailed down the back of the desk and disappeared toward the wall socket. She bent carefully, with the faintest creak of joint sand, examined the cord. It had been unplugged, not switched off, but removed entirely from the socket. She glanced toward the wall. The socket itself bore faint scorch marks along one edge. Inspector Drew followed her gaze. "We noticed that," he said. "Possibly an electrical fault. Could explain why he resorted to a candle." "Possibly," Miss Marple agreed. Yet her eyes had shifted again, this time to the book lying open on the desk. She touched its pages delicately. The topmost edge was clean, uncut. He had not begun reading this, she observed, though it was placed most conveniently. "He might have intended to," the inspector replied. "Indeed. But intentions leave traces. Inspector, people are creatures of habit." She turned to Mrs. Elmsley. "Did your brother trim candles himself?" "Trim them? I cannot imagine he would know how." Miss Marple studied the wick. It had burned steadily and cleanly, without excessive smoke. The melted wax had flowed in even streams, suggesting the candle had stood undisturbed for many hours. Yet near the base, barely noticeable beneath a ridge of hardened wax, was a slight indentation, as though something thin had once pressed against it and been removed. She straightened slowly, her gaze drifting toward the fireplace. The ashes were cold, but she crouched again to sift them gently with the tip of the poker. Among the grey fragments lay a tiny curl of blackened material, no larger than a fingernail. She lifted it carefully. It was not paper, nor wood, but something fibrous, perhaps the remnant of a narrow cord. Inspector Drew watched her with growing impatience. "Surely you don't imagine someone climbed down the chimney and tied him up like a Christmas goose?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said mildly. "Nothing so athletic. I was merely wondering why a man who disliked candles should light one and sit so very still beside it." She crossed the room to the window and examined the frost. The pattern along the lower pane was faintly smeared, not enough to suggest a hand pressed there, but disturbed nonetheless. Outside, the garden remained pristine. She smiled faintly, as though at a private joke. Behind her, the housemaid shifted nervously. "It were a queer light," the girl blurted suddenly. "Not steady, like. It flickered dreadful about midnight." Miss Marple turned at once. "Flickered, you say?" "Yes, miss. I thought the wind had got in, though the windows were shut." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but a sharper gleam kindled behind them. "A candle that burned evenly leaves one kind of story, a candle that flickers leaves quite another." She glanced once more at the unplugged lamp, the scorched socket, and the neat little note declaring it must end. "Such a curious arrangement," she murmured. "Almost as though someone wished the night itself to be measured precisely the last inch of wax." Inspector Drew seized upon Miss Marple's remark about time with professional interest, and by early afternoon he had gathered the small circle of those connected to Mr. Harcourt into the drawing-room. The winter light had already begun to thin, casting long blue shadows across the carpet, and the atmosphere felt closed despite the cold. Mrs. Elmsley sat upright on the sofa, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles shone white. The housemaid hovered near the door, twisting her apron. Opposite them stood Mr. Leonard Briggs, Mr. Harcourt's solicitor, who had arrived upon hearing the news, his thin face composed in lines of appropriate solemnity. Inspector Drew began methodically, confirming times. Mrs. Elmsley repeated that her brother had retired to the study shortly after 9. "He said he had correspondence to finish," she added. "He was in excellent spirits, quieter than usual, perhaps, but not distressed." "You heard nothing further?" the inspector pressed. "Nothing at all. I am a heavy sleeper." The housemaid, Ellen, spoke next. She confirmed she had taken in the tea tray at 8:30. "He were particular that night," she said hesitantly. "Asked if the post had come. I told him no, sir." It were a bit sharp-like, the way he asked. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Sharp. In what way? As if he expected something. Mr. Briggs cleared his throat smoothly. Julian had been awaiting certain documents, he explained. Perfectly routine business matters. Business of a worrying nature? Miss Marple asked gently. The solicitor's smile did not quite reach his eyes. All business contains worries, miss? Marple, she supplied pleasantly. Quite. But nothing extraordinary. He was in robust financial health. Inspector Drew shifted the focus. And you, Mr. Briggs, did you last see the deceased? Yesterday afternoon in my office in Much Benham. We discussed revisions to his will. The room seemed to draw tighter at that. Mrs. Elmsley looked up sharply. Revisions? Merely adjustments? Briggs replied quickly. Julian was a meticulous man. He wished to ensure clarity. Miss Marple tilted her head. And did those adjustments concern you, Mrs. Elmsley? Her answer came a fraction too slowly. The second do not involve myself in such matters. My brother was generous. Inspector Drew made a note. What time did you leave his office, Mr. Briggs? Shortly before 4. And you had no further contact with him? None whatsoever. The housemaid shifted again. Beg pardon, sir, she said timidly, but I thought I heard the telephone ring about 10 o'clock. Just once. I was upstairs, so I can't be certain. Mrs. Elmsley frowned. The telephone? I heard nothing. Inspector Drew turned sharply. Was there a call logged? There is no exchange record yet, he admitted. We shall inquire. Miss Marple's gaze had settled upon Mrs. Elmsley once more. You said your brother was quieter than usual. Did he dine as normal? Yes, though he barely touched his pudding. And had he quarrelled with anyone recently? Not to my knowledge. Mr. Briggs interjected smoothly. Julian had strong opinions, certainly, but no enemies. Miss Marple smiled faintly. How fortunate. A subtle tension began to hum beneath the polite exchanges. Briggs answered readily, almost eagerly, offering details before they were fully requested. Mrs. Elmsley, by contrast, seemed to retreat further into herself with each question, her voice thinning. When asked whether she possessed a key to the study, she admitted she did for emergencies only but insisted it remained in her bedroom drawer. Inspector Drew dispatched a constable to verify it. It was indeed there. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, the key was found inside the study door. Yes, the inspector agreed, turned firmly. Ellen suddenly spoke again. It were that light, miss. It flickered something awful near midnight, like it were fighting the dark. Was the door quite shut then? Miss Marple asked. Oh, yes, miss. I always check before bed. Miss Marple folded her hands. A telephone that may have rung. A will revised that afternoon? A sister unaware of its contents. A solicitor perhaps too composed. A candle measuring out the night while the electric lamp lay unplugged beside a scorched socket. Each account fitted neatly on its own, yet together they jostled like ill-cut pieces of a puzzle. Outside, dusk pressed against the frosted windows. Within, the voices quieted, leaving behind a residue of something unspoken, an undercurrent of motive and fear that had not yet found its words. Miss Marple looked from one face to another, her expression as mild as ever, but her eyes had sharpened. Somewhere among these careful statements lay the first true crack in the story, and she intended to find where the wax had begun to melt. The drawing-room gradually emptied under Inspector Drew's quiet authority, yet the tension lingered like the faint scent of extinguished wax. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting untouched in her lap, while the inspector paced slowly before the hearth. The statements had been taken, the alibis loosely sketched, and yet nothing aligned cleanly. Each thread seemed plausible in isolation, but when drawn together they snarled into a knot. The will, Miss Marple said at last, her voice mild but precise. It seems the most immediate alteration in Mr. Harcourt's life. Inspector Drew nodded. Mr. Briggs has confirmed there was to be a new draft. We'll know its contents by tomorrow. The previous will, it seems, left the bulk of the estate to Mrs. Elmsley. And now? Miss Marple asked. That, he replied, is what interests me. Greed presented itself first, simple and direct. If Mrs. Elmsley had reason to believe her inheritance was threatened, desperation might have stirred. Yet her distress did not ring false, it was too raw, too unstudied, and she possessed no obvious means to contrive a locked-room mystery without assistance. Still, Miss Marple had long known that desperation could lend surprising ingenuity to the mildest of individuals. Then there was Mr. Briggs. The solicitor's composure was admirable, perhaps too admirable. He had been the last confirmed visitor to see Mr. Harcourt alive. He had discussed alterations to a will whose details remained conveniently undisclosed. If he stood to gain financially or otherwise through those revisions, the motive would be subtle but potent. Moreover, he had displayed a curious readiness to frame the changes as insignificant before anyone had suggested they were otherwise. "And what of the telephone?" Miss Marple murmured. "If it rang at 10, as Ellen believes, someone might have spoken with him shortly before his death." Inspector Drew rubbed his chin. "We've sent for the exchange logs. If a call came through, we'll know its origin." Fear entered the maze next. The note it must end could suggest blackmail, pressure, some unseen coercion. Mr. Harcourt had inquired sharply about the post, expecting documents. If something failed to arrive earlier in the day, it might have unsettled him. A man awaiting ruin could stage his own death to resemble suicide. Yet why the elaborate candle? Why the locked door so theatrically secured? Miss Marple rose slowly and drifted back toward the study, the inspector following. The candle stump still stood upon the desk, mute and accusatory. "Time," she said softly. "The candle measures time." A man wishing to create an impression of prolonged solitude might rely upon such a device. "You think he lit it deliberately to suggest he was alive for hours?" the inspector asked. "Or someone else wished us to believe that?" Revenge offered another path. Mr. Harcourt had been wealthy, exacting, not universally adored. A dismissed servant, a slighted associate, a relative with grievance assoni might harbour resentment. Yet no outsider had been seen near the cottage, and the snow-frosted garden betrayed no intrusion. The crime, if crime it was, had been contained within these walls. Miss Marple's gaze fell once more upon the scorched socket, an electrical fault, she mused. Convenient, if genuine. But if contrived, it would necessitate some knowledge of wiring. Mr. Harcourt was not mechanically inclined, the inspector said. "But Mr. Briggs?" she asked lightly. "Or even Mrs. Elmsley?" The inspector considered this. "Briggs served in the Royal Engineers during the war. He mentioned it when we spoke privately." "A useful skill," Miss Marple murmured. "Yet jealousy, too, cast its faint shadow. The revision of a will can unsettle loyalties. If Mrs. Elmsley feared displacement by some new beneficiary, a charity perhaps, or an unexpected resentment might grow quietly. And if Mr. Briggs anticipated control over the estate as executor, ambition might tempt him toward darker measures. Still, none of these motives alone explain the peculiar precision of the candle, the unplugged lamp, the flickering light observed at midnight. The elements felt arranged, almost staged, as though each suspect had been handed a fragment of the truth and instructed to guard it carefully. Inspector Drew exhaled slowly. "Every path leads somewhere," he said, "but none lead all the way." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is because we are looking at motives as though they stand alone. In my experience, they rarely do. Greed may walk beside fear, revenge may disguise itself as duty. The difficulty is not in finding a motive but in discovering which one required the candle to burn until dawn." Outside, darkness settled fully over Rosebank Cottage. Within, the maze of reasons tightened, and somewhere at its centre lay the simple fact of a man dead behind a locked door, his final hours measured in melting wax. By the following morning, the atmosphere at Rosebank Cottage had shifted from confusion to a brisk, almost triumphant purpose. Inspector Drew arrived shortly after breakfast with a sharpened expression and a folded document in his hand. The exchange records had come through, and with them, what appeared to be the missing piece. A telephone call had indeed been placed to Rosebank Cottage at 9:57 p.m. originating from Much Benham, more precisely from the offices of Mr. Leonard Briggs. The timing struck like a bell. Briggs had stated he left his office shortly before 4 and had no further contact with Mr. Harcourt. Yet someone from his line had telephoned the cottage less than an hour after Mr. Harcourt retired to his study. Confronted with this information, Briggs adjusted his cuffs and offered a measured explanation. He had, he said, returned briefly to retrieve a misplaced ledger. While there, he recalled an additional clause in the revised will and rang Mr. Harcourt to clarify a detail. The call had been brief, no more than a minute. And what was clarified? Inspector Drew demanded. "A minor alteration regarding executorship," Briggs replied. Julian wished the matter simplified. It was enough. The inspector's theory formed swiftly and with satisfying symmetry. Briggs, aware that the new will might not favour Mrs. Elmsley, perhaps even himself had engineered the electrical fault earlier in the day, ensuring the lamp would fail. He had telephoned at 10 to confirm Mr. Harcourt was alone, then visited under cover of darkness with a duplicate key to the front door he might easily have retained in his professional capacity. Inside, he could have administered poison something subtle, leaving no immediate trace lit the candle to fabricate a timeline, and secured the study from within using some simple device before departing unnoticed. The burned remnant in the hearth suggested string or cord, perhaps used to manipulate the key. By noon, Briggs was formally detained pending further inquiry. The village buzzed with the relief of resolution. Motive lay in the altered will opportunity in the late-night telephone call knowledge of wiring in his military past. Even Mrs. Elmsley, pale but composed, seemed steadied by the certainty of accusation directed elsewhere. Yet Miss Marple did not share the general satisfaction. She sat quietly once more in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking in a gentle rhythm that belied the quickness of her thoughts. The inspector outlined his conclusions to her with restrained pride. "It fits rather neatly," he finished. "The candle becomes a mere prop. The telephone call places him there in spirit if not in person. And that bit of cord in the fireplace almost certainly from his contrivance." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is neat," she agreed softly. "Very neat. You are not convinced." "Oh, I am convinced of many things," she said. "But I find myself troubled by one small inconsistency." Inspector Drew sighed faintly. "Which is?" "The flickering light," she replied. Ellen was quite certain it flickered near midnight. If Mr. Briggs committed the deed shortly after 10, as your theory suggests, and then arranged the candle carefully to burn undisturbed, why should it flicker so violently hours later? A well-trimmed candle in a closed room burns with admirable steadiness. A draught from the chimney, perhaps. Possibly. But the ashes were cold and undisturbed. And there is something else. She paused, choosing her words with care. The scorch marks on the socket. If Mr. Briggs engineered them earlier in the day, why unplug the lamp afterward? A man staging suicide might simply switch it off. Inspector Drew hesitated. He may have wished to emphasize the candle. "Indeed," she murmured, "but emphasis can betray overthought." Outside, the frost had begun to melt under a pale sun, leaving the garden damp and glistening. Within the cottage, the mood hovered between relief and unease. Briggs sat under guard, outwardly calm, perhaps trusting in the insufficiency of circumstantial proof. Mrs. Elmsley moved about quietly, offering tea to the constable as though normality might be coaxed back into place. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. The evidence pointed decisively, yet the arrangement of it all felt rehearsed, almost obliging. She had seen such eagerness before when events seemed to align too perfectly around a single suspect. Somewhere within the tidy narrative lay a gap as thin and dangerous as a crack in cooling wax. And in that narrow space, she suspected, the true hand behind the candle still waited, patient and unseen. Miss Marple did not leave Rosebank Cottage that afternoon. Instead, she requested almost apologetically see the previous will. Inspector Drew, though mildly exasperated, obliged. The document was brought from the solicitor's safe under supervision, its contents read aloud in the quiet study where the candle had once stood. The earlier will was simple. The estate to Mrs. Elmsley, with modest legacies to the housemaid and several charities, Mr. Briggs appointed executor with standard fees. "And the new draft?" Miss Marple asked. Inspector Drew cleared his throat. According to notes recovered from Briggs' office, Mr. Harcourt intended to reduce his sister's share significantly and establish a private trust. The primary beneficiary was to be a Mr. Arthur Linden. Mrs. Elmsley, who had insisted on being present, stiffened visibly. "Arthur?" she whispered. "That is impossible." "Who is Mr. Linden?" Miss Marple asked gently. "My nephew, Mrs. Elmsley replied after a pause. "My son." Though Julian would never acknowledge him as such, the air shifted at once. Inspector Drew's pencil halted mid-scratch. "Your son?" "He quarrelled with Julian years ago," she said, her voice thin but steady. "Arthur invested in a shipping venture in Julian's advice, though my brother later denied it. The venture failed. Arthur was ruined. Julian accused him of incompetence and cut him off entirely. We have not spoken of him in this house for nearly a decade." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And yet, Mr. Harcourt intended to name him principal beneficiary?" "So it appears," Inspector Drew said grimly. "The trust was to provide Arthur with an income but not direct control of the capital. A reconciliation, thinquiet and recent. Miss Marple considered the implications. Did Arthur know of this change?" "I cannot imagine how," Mrs. Elmsley said quickly. "Julian was stubborn to the last." "Was he?" Miss Marple murmured. Further inquiry revealed that Arthur Linden had returned to the district only 3 weeks earlier, lodging at a modest inn in Much Benham. He had not visited Rosebank Cottage openly, but he had been seen walking near the lane on several evenings. Inspector Drew dispatched a constable at once. Yet it was another detail that drew Miss Marple's attention more sharply. In the drawer of Mr. Harcourt's desk, beneath neatly stacked correspondence, lay an older bundle of letters tied with fading ribbon. They concerned the failed shipping venture butter exchanges between uncle and nephew, accusations of mismanagement, veiled threats of legal action. Among them was one letter written in a firmer, colder hand than the rest, signed not by Arthur, but by Leonard Briggs, acting in representation of my client. Miss Marple read it twice. Years ago, Briggs had represented Arthur in an attempt to recover funds from Mr. Harcourt. The case had collapsed quietly. No suit had been filed. The letters ended abruptly. Curious, she said softly. Very curious indeed. Inspector Drew frowned. You think Briggs and Arthur remained connected? It would not be unusual, she replied. A solicitor often retains clients. And if Mr. Harcourt intended to reinstate the nephew, the inspector continued slowly, that might threaten— What exactly? Control, Miss Marple said. Influence, or perhaps an old grievance never entirely settled. The shadows lengthened once more in the study, though the hour was still early. The past, long buried beneath village routine, had stirred. A ruined investment, a family estrangement, a solicitor once acting on behalf of a nephew now unexpectedly restored to favour. The tangled motives of the present seemed suddenly rooted in an older soil. Miss Marple closed the bundle of letters carefully. When grievances are left unresolved, she observed quietly, they do not disappear. They harden like wax. And when heat is applied again, they melt in very interesting patterns. Inspector Drew looked toward the empty space on the desk where the candle had stood. The case, which had seemed so neatly tied around a single man, now stretched backward through years of resentment and secrecy. Somewhere within that older quarrel lay the reason the candle had been lit and why it had been necessary for it to burn until dawn. Miss Marple did not immediately press for Arthur Linden's arrest when the constable returned to report that he was indeed lodging in Much Benham, and professed astonishment at his uncle's death. Instead, she asked that both Arthur and Mr. Briggs be brought not formally, but conversationalito Rosebank Cottage the following afternoon. Inspector Drew, though faintly wary of her methods, had begun to recognize that her gentlest suggestions often concealed the sharpest designs. They assembled once more in the study, the room restored as nearly as possible to its original arrangement. The desk stood in its former position. The electric lamp had been returned to the scorched socket, but left unplugged. Upon the blotter, Miss Marple had placed a new white candle, identical in height and thickness to the one found burned to its stump. It stood upright in the same brass holder, pristine and untouched. Arthur Linden proved to be a lean, pale man in his early 30s, with restless hands and eyes that flickered from object to object as though measuring the room for escape. He spoke quietly of reconciliation, claiming he had written to his uncle weeks earlier in hopes of mending old wounds. Mr. Briggs, seated opposite him, maintained his composed demeanour, though a faint tightness now edged his mouth. Miss Marple addressed them both with polite gravity. "We are troubled by a matter of timing," she said. "The candle that burned here was said to have lasted the entire night. Yet candles are not so obedient as we imagine. They lean, they gutter, they respond to the faintest disturbance." Inspector Drew folded his arms, watching closely. "I have taken the liberty," Miss Marple continued, "of obtaining a candle from the same manufacturer. It burns approximately 1 inch per hour under normal conditions. If left undisturbed, it would have reached its base shortly after 5 in the morning." She struck a match and lit the new candle. The flame steadied quickly, casting a soft glow over the desk. "Now," she said mildly, "we shall conduct a small experiment." She crossed to the window and opened it barely a fraction so little that the movement was almost imperceptible. A thin ribbon of cold air slipped into the room. At once the flame quivered and bent, its light wavering erratically. Ellen, standing near the door, inhaled sharply. "That's how it were, miss," she whispered. "Jumping about like that." Miss Marple nodded and closed the window. The flame regained its calm. She then turned to Arthur. "You walked near this lane on several evenings, did you not?" "Yes," he replied cautiously. "But I did not enter the house." "And yet you knew your uncle disliked candles," she said. He frowned. "Everyone knew that." "Quite so." Her gaze shifted to Mr. Briggs. "And you, of course, were aware of the alteration in the will?" "As I have stated," Briggs replied smoothly, "it was my professional duty." Miss Marple leaned slightly closer to the candle. "Here is what troubles me. If Mr. Harcourt lit the candle himself after an electrical failure, he would have shut the window firmly, being sensitive to draughts. Yet Ellen observed the flame flickering violently near midnight. For that to occur, a window must have been opened, however, slightly after the candle was lit. Arthur's hands stilled. Briggs remained motionless, and frost, Miss Marple continued softly, forms quickly on such a night. A window opened and then closed would leave a faint smear upon the pane. I saw that smear yesterday. Inspector Drew's eyes narrowed. There is only one person, Miss Marple went on, her tone still gentle, who had both reason to ensure the candle burned uneven litho suggest life where there was none knowledge that such a detail would mislead the timeline. Someone accustomed to constructing careful narratives. Arthur shifted in his chair. I don't understand. No, she agreed quietly. I believe you do not. Mr. Briggs, however, had grown very still indeed. The composure that had cloaked him since the beginning seemed to tighten rather than relax, as though held too rigidly in place. Miss Marple extinguished the experimental candle with a soft breath. It is curious, she said, how a flame reacts when disturbed. It reveals more than one intends. And in the silence that followed, a subtle crackle most invisible, yet unmistakable began to show in the solicitor's carefully constructed calm. The silence that followed Miss Marple's quiet observation did not shatter at once. It thinned, stretched, and then settled into something far more dangerous than protest. Inspector Drew's gaze remained fixed on Mr. Briggs, who met it with steady irritation rather than alarm. Arthur Linden looked from one face to another, bewildered and increasingly pale. I must object to insinuations founded upon air currents, Briggs said at last, his voice cool. A smear upon a pane proves nothing. Nor does a servant's impression of a flicker. Quite right, Miss Marple replied mildly. Which is why I rely upon rather more substantial matters. Inspector Drew cleared his throat. Such as the letters, he said pointedly. Your earlier representation of Mr. Linden. Your knowledge of the prior dispute. Briggs inclined his head. Professional history, nothing more. The interview broke shortly thereafter with no confession forthcoming, yet the delicate composure Briggs had maintained was undeniably strained. Inspector Drew ordered that the bundle of old correspondence, along with the notes regarding the revised will, be secured in the locked drawer of the study desk until they could be transferred formally to the station. It was scarcely an hour later that Ellen's scream tore through the cottage. Miss Marple, who had remained in the drawing-room, rose at once and moved surprisingly swiftly toward the study. Inspector Drew was already there, the desk drawer pulled open, its contents disturbed. The bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon was gone. For a moment no one spoke. The absence seemed louder than any presence. Papers lay skewed where they had been rifled. The small leather notebook containing Mr. Harcourt's annotations for the new will had vanished as well. They were here, Inspector Drew said sharply. I locked this drawer myself. Who has had access? Miss Marple asked quietly. Only those already in the house. Which meant all of them. Ellen stood trembling near the door. I only stepped away to fetch more coal, she stammered. I heard nothing. Arthur protested at once. You cannot think I have been in the garden with the constable the entire time. The constable confirmed it reluctantly. Briggs, however, had excused himself briefly, claiming a need for air. He now reappeared in the doorway, composed once more, though his eyes flickered momentarily toward the open drawer. What has occurred? He asked evenly. The letters, Inspector Drew said. They have disappeared. Briggs raised his brows. How unfortunate. Miss Marple did not look at him. Instead, she moved to the hearth. The fire had been newly stirred, flames licking brightly at the coal. She knelt with slow deliberation and used the poker to shift the embers aside. A fragment of charred paper curled at the edge of the grate, blackened beyond legibility save for a single surviving word near the margin. Linden. Inspector Drew swore under his breath. The stakes shifted in that instant. The theft was no petty act of panic, it was deliberate, timed precisely after suspicion had begun to pivot. Whoever had removed the letters understood their significance and feared their implications. Seal the room, the inspector ordered at once. No one leaves, but the damage had been done. Whatever evidence the correspondence might have yielded, financial arrangements, threats, collusion, was now reduced to ash. And yet, Miss Marple's expression did not reflect despair. If anything, her eyes sharpened further. To destroy a thing, she murmured softly, as often to admit its power. Inspector Drew looked at her. You anticipated this? I suspected urgency, she replied. The flame we disturbed has burned too close to certain fingers. Trust within the cottage, thin to transparency. Arthur avoided Briggs' gaze. Briggs stood very still, his calm restored with almost excessive care. Mrs. Elmsley, drawn by the commotion, clutched at the doorframe as though the house itself had shifted beneath her. The letters were gone, but their disappearance spoke more loudly than their contents ever could. Someone had acted quickly to prevent a connection from hardening into proof, and in doing so they had confirmed that the past, once stirred, was dangerous indeed. Miss Marple rose slowly from the hearth, brushing a trace of ash from her glove. The candle, the flicker, the will, the vanished lettersaw were converging. The truth had nearly surfaced once now, it had been forced back under. But she knew something of buried things. They have a habit, she thought, of rising again. Even as the ash of the charred letters cooled in the hearth, a deeper unease settled over Rosebank Cottage. Miss Marple sat near the window, her hands folded in her lap, eyes tracing the garden beyond, yet seeing far more than the snow-glossed hedges. Inspector Drew moved restlessly about the drawing-room, issuing quiet instructions to the constables, each step betraying the tension building in the narrow confines of the house. The stolen letters had been the first bold move, but Miss Marple suspected instinctively that it would not be the last. The knock came sharply on the door just after tea. A breathless messenger from the inn at Much Benham announced that Arthur Linden had vanished. His room had been locked from the inside, no note, no luggage, no trace save for a single chair overturned, its legs scratched across the wooden floor. The constable accompanying the messenger had tried the window locked, frost-laden, unbroken. Miss Marple rose, unshaken but attentive, and moved to the study once more. Inspector Drew followed, his brow dark. "This changes everything," he said. "If he's fled, it must mean guilt or fear." Miss Marple interrupted softly. "Fear can move a man faster than guilt ever could." She examined the window, noting the faint smudge on the pane where frost had been disturbed. Someone knew he might be here, and someone knew the house well enough to approach without leaving a mark. Yet the door shows no tampering. "That suggests the key or a duplicate." Inspector Drew frowned. "You think this is connected to the letters?" "Entirely," she said. "The letters, the flickering candle, the scorched socket are threads in the same weave. Whoever wished to bury the past is now actively ensuring that the present cannot interfere." Before the inspector could respond, a sudden crash echoed from the kitchen. Both turned sharply, hearts quickened as the door swung open to reveal the housemaid standing frozen. It's the safe," she stammered. "Someone's broken it." Rushing to the scene, Miss Marple and the inspector found the small iron safe forced open, its contents scattered. Only minor papers remained, the more sensitive documents, including a backup of the will's notes and financial records, were gone. The safe had been emptied in a manner both precise and deliberate, leaving no fingerprints save for the faintest smudge Miss Marple detected near the hinge, a subtle, deliberate misdirection, as if to draw attention away from the true method of entry. "You see," she said, her voice calm but pointed, "our villain is not merely reactive. He is anticipating every move, predicting every suspicion, and eliminating obstacles before they can interfere." The inspector's frustration was evident. "Briggs, it must be him. He has the knowledge, the motive, and clearly the means." Miss Marple allowed a faint smile. "Perhaps. Or perhaps the villain is cleverer still than we imagine. Observe the pattern. Each act escalates, each disruption creates urgency, each disappearance isolates those who might oppose him." She paused at the hearth, glancing once more at the candle stump and the scorched socket. "The candle taught us one thing. Time can be manipulated. The letters taught us another. The past can be buried but not erased. And now, the disappearance proves one final truth: criminal will not wait to be caught. He strikes first, and the danger grows with each hour." Outside, dusk fell swiftly, drawing long shadows through the frost-stiffened hedges. Inside, the atmosphere thickened with suspicion and fear. Mrs. Elmsley, drawn pale and trembling from her room, clutched at the back of a chair, whispering anxiously about her nephew. The constables secured the perimeter, doors and windows examined again and again, yet the cottage felt impossibly vulnerable. Miss Marple's eyes, serene but sharp, swept the room. "We are dealing with a mind that enjoys the game," she murmured. "One that believes the pieces can always be moved before the players notice. But even the most careful hand leaves a trisand we shall find it." The case, which had seemed intricate but containable, had now grown urgent and dangerous. What began as a puzzling death behind a locked door had become a race not merely to uncover a murderer, but to anticipate the next act, prevent the next disappearance, and confront a villain who remained several steps ahead. The night stretched long and cold, yet within Miss Marple's quiet vigilance, A plan was already forming. The next morning dawned pale and frosted over, with sunlight weakly piercing the clouded sky. Rosebank Cottage felt heavier than usual, the air taut with unsaid fears and the faint smell of charred paper still lingering in the hearth. Miss Marple, however, moved with calm precision, surveying the study with eyes that missed nothing. She had spent the night quietly reflecting, retracing each small observation, each whispered remark, each gesture that had seemed inconsequential in the swirl of thefts, disappearances and stolen letters. In the midst of chaos, the mind often clutches at a fragment overlooked by others. Her gaze fell once more upon the candle stump. She recalled the flicker, the subtle smear on the window pane, the careful positioning of the candle in the brass holder. Then, more quietly, she noticed the angle of the desk itself. It had been slightly shifted after the initial inspection, a barely perceptible adjustment, one that no casual observer would have noticed. Yet it explained much. The candle had never been fully centered because it had been deliberately angled to cast shadows across the desk, not just to suggest a passage of time, but to obscure something else entirely. Miss Marple moved to the mantelpiece, brushing her hand along the edge. There, almost hidden beneath a layer of dust and ash, lay a small fragment of paper. It was blackened slightly at the edges, as if someone had attempted to burn it and abandoned the effort. The writing was faint, barely legible, yet the word Briggs stood clearly. The letters were deliberately placed where the candlelight would make them seem a smudge if glimpsed casually. A deliberate misdirection intended to focus attention elsewhere. She leaned back and recalled the minor discrepancies she had observed. The servant's description of a flickering light, the subtle scorch marks on the socket, the fact that the electric lamp had been unplugged rather than merely switched off. Each seemed unremarkable alone, yet together they formed a rhythm sequence repeated whenever Briggs had acted in the past. The pattern was audaciously simple, every act designed to mislead, yet each act left a single thread of truth. The criminal's overconfidence had been its own undoing. Miss Marple rose and walked to the window, studying the faint frost patterns. A hand had pressed here, someone had opened the sash slightly, and that detail connected all the incidents: the flickering candle, the displaced letters, the vanished nephew. The villain sought to manipulate time and perception, yet had relied upon predictable methods and a certain arrogance, the belief that no one would notice a small, mundane trace, and Miss Marple had. She turned to Inspector Drew, who had been silently observing her. "I believe we have overlooked the most obvious instrument," she said. "It is not the letters themselves, nor the telephone, nor even the candle in its entirety. It is the misdirection within the candlelight way it was used to control perception. The criminal relied upon it, confident that no one would notice the subtle clues in its behavior." Inspector Drew frowned. "You mean the candle was more than a prop?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "It measured the night, yes, but it also hid a message in its shadow. Every careless glance misled the eye, every small Gesturian angle. A smear, a flicker was calculated to produce false assumptions. And now, by following those tiny deviations, we see the pattern in full, the sequence of deception, the chronology of theft and disappearance, the unseen hand guiding each action. Outside, the garden remained cold and unyielding, yet the clarity within the cottage was growing. The pieces, once scattered and chaotic, now fell into place. Each small detail, each overlooked comment, each subtle shift formed a lattice of evidence, revealing not just motive, but method. Miss Marple's keen eye had illuminated what others had missed entirely. The truth had been hiding in plain sight all along, patiently waiting for the right mind to recognize the invisible pattern beneath the apparent disorder. And with that realization, the final stage of the investigation anticipating the next move, confronting the villain, and reclaiming the missing evidence, was poised to begin. The night, measured in wax and shadow, had revealed its secret, and Miss Marple understood that the threads of deception could now be traced to their source. Miss Marple spent the next hours quietly reconstructing the events in her mind, moving pieces of evidence as though they were objects on a chessboard. The candle, the scorched socket, the faint smear on the window, the vanished letters, all of it suggested not merely a crime of convenience or opportunity, but a mind that derived satisfaction from control, from watching carefully laid plans unfold exactly as imagined. The realization struck her like a cold wind. This was not a crime of greed or revenge alone. It was far more intimate, more insidious. By mid-afternoon, she asked Inspector Drew to summon Mr. Briggs once more. The solicitor entered the study with measured calm, though a subtle tension lingered beneath the surface, a faint tremor in the fingers that clasped his gloves. Miss Marple did not rise. She observed him as one might a bird in a cage, noting the smallest twitches and micro-expressions that betrayed the careful mask of composure. "Mr. Briggs," she began gently, "we have seen how thoroughly you planned the night at Rosebank Cottage. The candle, the letters, the disappearance, the misdirection, it was all executed with precision. Yet there is one question that remains unanswered. Why?" Briggs' eyes flickered, a brief shadow passing where none should have been. "I do not understand," he said, though his voice was just a shade too clipped, too deliberate. "You have been protecting someone," Miss Marple continued softly, "or perhaps yourself. Yes, but that alone does not explain the lengths you went to. You knew the documents could have been discovered. You knew a third party might become involved. Yet you still acted with the patience of someone accustomed to planning far ahead." He inhaled sharply, a gesture almost imperceptible, yet enough to alert her. "You are suggesting?" "I am suggesting," she said, leaning slightly forward, "that the crime was never merely about money, nor merely about inheritance or a grievance over a will. You wished to assert control over the narrative itself. You desired to orchestrate the events of that night, to manipulate perception, to see fear and uncertainty in others, and know that you were the conductor of it all." Briggs' jaw tightened. "And if I did?" Miss Marple's blue eyes, soft but unyielding, met his. "Then you have committed a crime not of necessity, but of compulsion. A crime for which the real motive is power over others' minds. You needed to measure time, manipulate light, and engineer disappearance, not for profit, not for revenge, but for the satisfaction of absolute control. And control, as you discovered, is a fragile thing. It requires constant attention, constant calculation. You could not afford to allow the letters to remain, or the nephew to linger. Each risk had to be eliminated before it could disrupt the delicate balance you had created." Briggs' hands trembled slightly, betraying the first sign of fear she had seen. "How," he began, but faltered. "The candle," Miss Marple said softly, "was a mere instrument, yet it revealed everything. It measured the night, yes, but it also revealed your own pattern. You underestimated the value of small observations, of human perception. You assumed that by planning meticulously you could escape notice entirely. But I observed, Mr. Briggs, and the mind that manipulates others often leaves its own signature, hidden in the details." His composure broke, and for the first time he slumped, as if the weight of the truth had physically descended upon him. "It was only to protect Arthur, to ensure that Julian's intentions did not harm him further. That was my duty." Miss Marple's tone was gentle but firm. "Your duty became obsession. You overstepped, turning protection into manipulation, concern into crime. That is why the letters had to vanish, why the nephew was removed, why the candle had to burn as it did. The motive is no longer merely financial, Mr. Briggs. It is psychologically a need to dominate the unfolding story itself." Inspector Drew stepped forward, his face grave. "Enough of games. Mr. Briggs, you are under arrest." Briggs' eyes flickered one final time to the window, to the candle that had illuminated the night, and then downward, accepting that the carefully constructed narrative he had spent years manipulating had collapsed. The crime, once cloaked in layers of deceit, greed, and pretense, now lay bare in the stark light of understanding. And for Miss Marple, the revelation was clear. Human nature, in all its complexity, often drives actions far beyond what any law can easily anticipate. The motive, long hidden beneath layers of wax paper and shadows, had finally emerged, and it was far darker, far more personal, and far more compelling than anyone had imagined. Miss Marple allowed the quiet to settle over Rosebank Cottage for a brief moment before speaking. "Inspector Drew, I believe the time has come to conclude this matter. We know the mind behind the candle, the stolen letters, the vanished nephew, and the tampered safe. Now we must see how it responds when faced with certainty." Drew nodded, though his expression carried the weariness of the past few days. The constables, previously stationed at doors and windows, now assembled at the threshold of the study, ready for action but silent at her instruction. Miss Marple moved deliberately to the desk and replaced the experimental candle, lighting it and allowing its steady flame to illuminate the room. Briggs entered as requested, calm, his gloves neatly folded in one hand, the other brushing lightly against his coat pocket. He gave a polite nod to the inspector and Miss Marple. "You wish to see me?" he asked, voice even, though the faintest tremor betrayed a premonition of what was to come. "Yes, Mr. Briggs," Miss Marple replied, settling into the armchair nearest the hearth. "We have considered the entire sequence of events: the stolen letters, the vanished documents, the flickering candle, and the disappearance of Mr. Linden. All of it fits one pattern, a pattern which you have left repeatedly exposed through the smallest details, despite your careful planning. Briggs stiffened imperceptibly. "And what pattern is that?" he asked, though his fingers fidgeted against the gloves. "The pattern of control," she said gently. "A mind seeking to orchestrate every element, to determine not merely events but the perceptions of those who witness them. Your need to dominate the unfolding story became a motive in itself, Mr. Briggs. And while we could not prove your hand without the letters, the pattern you created reveals it unmistakably." For a moment, Briggs said nothing, his gaze flicking nervously to the flickering candlelight, as though trying to read a secret in the shadows. Then he straightened abruptly. "You have no proof, none. I acted for Mr. Linden's protection. I did nothing criminal. You cannot arrest me on speculation." Miss Marple allowed a faint, knowing smile. "Ah, but Mr. Briggs, the proof need not always be tangible. You see, when one arranges a crime with such precision, one leaves traces in behavior. The way you maintain composure, the way your hand trembled slightly when speaking of the letters, the way you over-explained each alluvial of it forms a signature as distinctive as handwriting." Briggs' eyes narrowed. "Signature? You mean you can exactly," she said, interrupting gently. "We know the letters were destroyed in the hearth. We know the safe was tampered with. We know Mr. Linden's disappearance was orchestrated. And we know the candle was deliberately angled to mislead. All these facts together create a chain which can only point to one person." He stared at her, jaw tight, glancing briefly at Drew and the constables, then back at the steady flame on the desk. The tension was palpable, almost unbearable. Miss Marple's eyes were calm, unyielding, the kind that had seen human nature in its most subtle forms and judged it without malice. Briggs' composure finally fractured. His shoulders slumped, his gloves dropped to the floor with a muted thud, and he exhaled sharply. "Very well," he said, voice low. "Yes, I arranged it all. I had to, for Arthur. I could not allow anyone else to interfere. I only wanted to protect him." Inspector Drew stepped forward immediately, placing a firm hand on Briggs' arm. "You are under arrest for the death of Julian Harcourt, destruction of evidence, and tampering with witnesses." Briggs offered no resistance, his confession emerging more from resignation than defiance. Miss Marple watched quietly as the constables led him away, noting how the mind that had orchestrated so much chaos now seemed suddenly small, ordinary, and fatigued by its own calculations. The candle continued to burn steadily, casting calm light across the desk. The letters were gone, the nephew was safe, and the pattern of deceit had finally unravelled. Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression serene. The crime, intricate and deliberate, had been brought to an end not by force, but by careful observation, patience, and the recognition that even the most meticulous mind leaves a trace when driven by obsession. Outside, dust pressed softly against the frosted windows. Inside, the house felt lighter, as if the shadows that had lingered for days had been drawn back by the truth. For Miss Marple, the final confrontation had been as inevitable as dawn, and as satisfying as justice quietly delivered. The following morning, Rosebank Cottage seemed tranquil, almost ordinary, with sunlight spilling gently over frost-frosted lawns, and the remnants of last night's tension still lingering in the quiet rooms. Inspector Drew had departed briefly to file reports, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. She moved through the study slowly, touching the edge of the desk where the candle had burned, letting her eyes linger on the small scorch mark on the socket. The case, it seemed, had concluded neatly. Briggs confessed, Arthur Linden was safe, the letters had been destroyed, and the pattern of deception had been revealed. Yet, as she knelt to examine a faint smear along the hearth edge, a quiet intuition stirred within her a whisper that all was not as simple as it appeared. Her attention shifted to the hearth itself. The ashes from the destroyed letters were unevenly scattered, as if something more had been hidden beneath the first layer and removed before the fire consumed it. Miss Marple ran her fingers lightly through the grey powder and pulled out a fragment of paper, slightly larger than before, its edges burnt but the words still partially legible. It was a note addressed not to Briggs, but to someone else entirely. "Ensure nothing traces back to you. He must not know until it is too late." Her heart skipped. This was no ordinary posthumous instruction. The language suggested a second hand, someone orchestrating events behind the scenes while allowing Briggs to take the fall. Someone who had manipulated not only the letters, the candle, and the safe, but also Briggs' sense of loyalty and duty. The confession, while real, had been guided to shield a deeper truth. Just then, Mrs. Elmsley entered the room, holding a small, sealed envelope she had found in her private correspondence drawer. The second thought this was merely old papers, she said, handing it to Miss Marple. The envelope bore a handwriting unfamiliar to all but Miss Marple, and as she unfolded it, she read the words aloud softly. All is in place. He believes he has triumphed. Wait until tomorrow, when the final piece is moved. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. An accomplice. Or perhaps the true mind behind the entire scheme, she murmured. The pieces fell into place. The meticulous planning, the exploitation of Briggs' sense of duty, the vanished letters, the strategic disappearance of Arthur Lindenau were part of a larger design. Briggs was an instrument, not the conductor. Inspector Drew returned at that moment, and Miss Marple called him into the study. She explained her discovery, showing him the fragment from the hearth and the note Mrs. Elmsley had handed her. Drew's brows knit in confusion and alarm. Are you suggesting? Yes, she said softly but firmly. Someone has orchestrated this from the shadows, allowing Briggs to act as the visible agent, the confessed culprit. But the true mastermind remains at liberty, waiting for the final act to reveal itself. We must anticipate it before another move is made. The realization brought a sudden urgency. Every detail from the past days of precise timing of the candle's flicker, the theft of the letters, the nephew's disappearance, the safe's tampering had been part of a carefully constructed narrative, designed to mislead and misdirect. The final twist was not in the crime already committed, but in what remained to be done. Miss Marple walked to the window and looked out over the frost-laden garden. He or she is clever, certainly, she murmured, but cleverness alone leaves traces, and traces lead to truth. She turned to Drew with a quiet intensity. We must consider everyone still present in the village, every prior connection to Mr. Harcourt, and every subtle influence upon Briggs. The real criminal knows the confession will satisfy the authorities, and so will move next, confident they remain unnoticed. The inspector swallowed hard, the weight of the new possibility pressing down upon him. And what do we do now? Miss Marple's gaze returned to the study, to the candle, to the ashes, and to the letters, both destroyed and surviving in fragments. We wait but we watch. Every shadow, every gesture, every whisper must now be treated as evidence. The final act is yet to be played, and I intend to see it through before another lifer, another truthy is compromised. Outside, the sun dipped behind a thin veil of clouds, casting long, dark shadows across the frost. Inside, the cottage held its breath. The case, which had seemed solved, had shifted once more, and Miss Marple, ever patient, ever observant, prepared herself for the revelation that was still to come, the last-minute twist that would test her ingenuity one final time. The next day brought a brittle, bright frost that glittered across the hedges of Rosebank Cottage. Inside, Miss Marple sat quietly in the study, the room arranged exactly as it had been the night before, candle-lit for effect and a subtle hum of expectation in the air. Inspector Drew, though resolute, betrayed a tension he could not entirely conceal. The cottage had become a stage, and every guest, every suspect, and every shadow was a player in a drama that still had one final act. Word had come that Mr. Linden had returned unexpectedly to the inn, drawn back perhaps by intuition, or by some whispered hint that the danger had not fully passed. Miss Marple had anticipated this, and so the plan was simple. Allow the potential mastermind one final opportunity to act and observe. It was a test of patience, of human nature, and of the subtle signs that often betrayed the most careful intentions. Hours passed in stillness until a soft tap at the window drew Miss Marple's attention. A shadow lingered just beyond the frost-laden panes, someone watching, hesitant. Her keen eyes, accustomed to reading hesitation as clearly as confession, noted the movement and a faint smudge on the sill, too deliberate, too precise to be mere curiosity. The door opened before she could rise, and a figure stepped in with quiet elegance, a calm exterior that belied the urgency beneath. It was Mrs. Elmsley, her face pale but determined, holding a small envelope she had intercepted from the post earlier that morning. I thought this was merely correspondence, she said, handing it to Miss Marple. The envelope bore the initials E.L., an unfamiliar hand, yet a connection to the mystery that had silently guided every event for days. Miss Marple read the note carefully. All arrangements have been made. He will take the fall. The final piece is elsewhere. Watch closely. The pieces fell into place. Briggs had been an instrument, a loyal man manipulated by a mind that preferred invisibility. But the real architect had operated from the margins, guiding events with subtlety that even a vigilant law officer could have missed. Miss Marple's mind traced the evidence. The candle's flicker designed to distract, the letters stolen and partially destroyed, the nephew's disappearance to create urgency, and the false confession coaxed to the surface. Every act had left faint, almost imperceptible trace these smudge on the window, the scorch marks on the socket, the angle of the candle deliberately misread by all except the most observant eye. Inspector Drew, watching quietly, finally broke the silence. "You're saying Briggs was not the real villain?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said gently. "He acted out of loyalty, not malice, and yet his actions obscured the true hand behind it all. The orchestrator remained hidden, manipulating events while confident that suspicion would settle on the visible participant. That is why the letter bears those initials. They were meant to ensure the chain of command and the illusion of inevitability." A sudden knock echoed through the cottage, deliberate and firm. Miss Marple, without rising, sensed the final confrontation. The door opened, and a figure stepped inside, a quiet, unassuming woman whose presence had gone unnoticed among the bustle of the household. Ellen, the housemaid. She held another note, this one confirming her observations during the night. She had seen the unseen hand that moved objects, disturbed letters, and left small but revealing traces unnoticed by all others. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I did not wish to intervene, but I saw him know every step she took." The realization struck like a sudden frost. The real mastermind had been among them all along, manipulating subtly from the shadows, using trust and invisibility as a weapon. She had escaped detection, her identity hidden beneath the guise of loyalty and familiarity. Miss Marple allowed a faint smile. "Justice, Inspector, is not always immediate, nor always complete. Some individuals may evade immediate consequence, yet every step leaves a trace, every misdeed reveals a signature. We have unraveled the pattern, seen the motive, and exposed the methods. The visible culprit is accounted for, the invisible one remains at liberty, but the threads that connect her to each act are undeniable. She may yet slip away, but she cannot erase her own design." Drew's jaw tightened, the unease in his eyes matching the quiet acknowledgement of an unfinished business that lingered like frost over the garden. Miss Marple rose, gently adjusting the candlelight, her expression serene. The case, in one sense, was resolved, yet in another, it remained a reminder that human cunning can shadow the wand, that the observant mind, ever patient and perceptive, is the only force capable of tracing even the most elusive patterns. Outside, the sun glittered on the frost, but inside Rosebank Cottage, a quiet truth settled. Justice had been delivered in part, the villain's methods exposed. Yet the final thread still whispered a warning that vigilance is the only guarantee against the shadows of cunning left to move unseen. Days passed quietly at Rosebank Cottage, the frost melting slowly from the hedges, sunlight stretching across the garden in long golden beams. The immediate danger had passed. Briggs was securely in custody, the letters what remained of them examined and catalogued. Arthur Linden returned safely to the inn. Inspector Drew had filed the necessary reports and returned to London, the sense of closure in his tone betraying a satisfaction tempered by the memory of the elusive hand still at large. Miss Marple, however, lingered, her presence unobtrusive, her sharp eyes absorbing every detail of the room and its surroundings, noting the slight movements of dust on the mantelpiece, the faint discoloration of a carpet near the hearth, even the subtle tilt of the desk where the candle had once stood. She moved slowly to the window and looked out over the garden. A soft wind stirred the remaining frost, brushing against the hedges like whispered secrets. The events of the past week played back in her mind, flickering candle, the vanished letters, the intricate misdirections, and finally the revelation that the mastermind, clever and patient, had escaped unnoticed. There was satisfaction in knowing the immediate crime had been resolved, yet an unshakable awareness lingered. Even the most meticulous plot leaves traces, and the most cunning villain cannot avoid all consequences. A small envelope resting on the writing desk caught her eye. It had arrived by no visible hand and bore only a single initial, scarcely legible. E. She lifted it carefully, noting the weight of a single folded paper inside. Opening it, she read a brief, cryptic line: "The candle burns anew, and time will reveal what shadows hide. Watch carefully." The words were simple, yet their meaning was layered, a reminder that another layer of intrigue, perhaps unrelated, perhaps the next chapter, awaited those willing to notice the subtleties. Miss Marple folded the note slowly, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. The familiar thrill of anticipation returned, subtle but undeniable. The cottage, though calm, felt charged with latent possibilities. It was a quiet reminder that human cunning rarely rests. The mind that manipulates, deceives, and orchestrates events is never fully dormant. Yet she also understood that patience and observation, the steady accumulation of small truths, were enough to keep the shadows in check. As she moved toward the door, her eyes fell once more upon the faintly scorched socket and the last remaining candle stub. Even in their simplicity, they told a story that had grown far beyond the immediate crime. A story of human motives, obsession, and the interplay between perception and reality. Every mark, every flicker of light, every overlooked smudge had contributed to revealing the true at hand, yet each also hinted that other truths might lie hidden, waiting for the perceptive mind to discover them. Miss Marple stepped outside into the crisp air, drawing her coat close around her. The village lay quiet, but her mind traced the patterns she had uncovered, considering how subtle influences, seemingly innocuous gestures, and carefully placed distractions could always conceal more than one expected. Her gaze lingered on the distant hills, where shadows lengthened in the late afternoon sun, and she felt the familiar spark of curiosity awaken, a signal that, despite this resolution, mysteries never truly end. Turning slowly toward the path leading back into the village, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The case at Rosebank Cottage had been resolved in part, yet the cryptic note and the traces of the unseen mastermind suggested that the world held more puzzles, more games of perception, and more threads to untangle. The satisfaction of justice coexisted with the awareness that vigilance was eternal, and that the mind attuned to subtle truths could always anticipate the next act before it unfolded. And so, with the frost glinting behind her and the wind whispering through the bare branches, Miss Marple walked steadily into the village, each step confident, each sense alert. She had brought closure to one tangled tale, but the faintest hint of the unknown lingered at the edges of her mind, a reminder that for a detective, the end of one mystery is only the beginning of another.